The Me Too movement is demanding massive shifts in the way that people interact. And while the spotlight hits the high-profile cases, the movement really progresses when we stop thinking about good guys and bad guys and start having honest, everyday conversations. So I sat down with a panel of reporters and real people who grapple with their own masculine expressions.
Who have I been up to this point as a man? What has that meant? And even if you think of yourself as a good guy or a nice guy, how have you maybe been part of the problem?
Masculinity should not be this fragile.
All of these things are happening now that changes the way we think about who we are, and I think that's just going to keep snowballing.
But first, I talked to somebody dedicated to empowering men to speak up for themselves.
When I was starting to really tap into the fact that I thought I identified as trans, I had lots of people in my life say, the world doesn't need another man, Aaron. Like, why would you add to that? You're just gonna become another tool of the patriarchy. And that weighed really heavily on me, and I had to ultimately make the choice that the world is not gonna be hurt by me authentically self-expressing, and actually the world needs another man like me.
Aaron is a trans educator who offers toxic masculinity workshops to men who may or may not grasp the gravity of rising movements like Me Too and struggle to really understand what it means for their own gender expression. Through this, Aaron's discovered that the story of his transition actually strikes a lot of similarities to the identity crisis that he's seeing amongst men in this moment.
I have deep compassion for what it feels like to have been told over and over and over again that your authentic emotional expression was going to get you in trouble. And to now be like, wait, I have permission to do that again? And I don't even, it's like being in cryo sleep for 50 years and waking up and having to use muscles that you haven't used in that long. Right. It is often these days what draws people to my story, because to be trans right now is to be radically self-expressed in a world that has conditioned you to be otherwise.
So is the Me Too movement as much of an overhaul for men, you think, or for the masculine as it is for the feminine?
Yes. For some of the men who are like, I don't know what to do in this world anymore, who have that kind of exasperated response to Me Too, there's this sense of like the rules of the game have changed, and you told me that if I acted this way, then I would be amazing, that everything would be okay. And I did that even against some of my deeper human instincts. And now, like, who am I? How do I reconstruct my identity and deeply move through not just claiming a more positive masculine archetype, but actually having to physically experience the grief, the loss, the shame, all of it, whether or not you are someone who has actively perpetrated violence in this life.
Aaron acknowledges that men hold a huge responsibility in the Me Too movement, but before they can fully show up, they need to take steps towards healing.
The first thing I would say is that it really starts with actually letting yourself understand how you feel in this moment. Oh, it's making me think about this, it's making me think about that. Just letting yourself write it out, helping your subconscious let you know why you're so triggered about it, because there may be things about your past that you don't understand or you don't remember. And then also doing that same thing for your understanding of masculinity. What's at stake for men is the ability to be able to show up fully and actually feel comfortable as yourself, to not feel like you have to defend yourself against anything, and release yourself from the violence that you too have experienced under the patriarchy.
Healing is a big part of empowering men in the Me Too movement, but accountability is just as important. Here to talk it out with me is the editorial director of HuffPost Personal, Noah Michelson, editor of HuffPost Black Voices, Taryn Finley, journalist and filmmaker Miloš Balac, and comedian, writer, and DJ Mamadou Njai. Noah, I want to start with you. What do you think it means to be traditionally masculine on the other side of this movement?
I think that's a great question. I think for so long, masculinity has been a really sort of like a beneficial thing. It's something that people wanted to be because it meant that you were capable, you were tough, you were strong. I think now, just in the last year and 2 years, we're starting to see that term is, we link it to toxic masculinity. We think about it in ways that is actually really harmful to our culture. And I think in some ways, maybe that's unfair, because masculinity can be a good thing too, right? I think we all have different traits.
I feel like currently men feel more challenged than they've ever felt challenged in their life, so they're trying to understand these sorts of things. And women who have been trying to talk about this for a very long time, they have the words for like how they feel, but men don't have the words for how they feel. And we're also not conditioned as men to use our words half the times. So
I think also, fortunately and unfortunately, the reason that Me Too has worked or started to work, 'cause I mean, it's over a decade old. It's not like Me Too hasn't been around, but what has happened is that we've seen consequences finally. And it sort of started at the top, so we see Weinstein get called out and we see what happened to him. People are saying, okay, people are serious now, and if I do this too, maybe I'm not R. Kelly, I'm not, Harvey Weinstein, but there could be consequences for me as well.
So to that point, Idris Elba recently said the Me Too movement is only difficult if you're a man with something to hide. If we're talking about accountability here, is it that simple?
It's not difficult to sort of support it. It might be difficult to grapple with what the realities are post Me Too, but if you're not a predator, what's the issue? Like, you're just having a conversation about how we need to change society and pop culture for the better.
I think that there is a level and like this nuance that we have to address, in that a lot of men don't want to talk about like those more subtlety things because they don't want to, they don't want to look in the mirror. They don't want to really actually change because they don't want to be seen as a predator themselves or as someone who does predatory behavior.
I think the conversations will be difficult and are difficult, but I don't think that getting on board should be something that is hard.
It shouldn't.
That's the nuance that I see. It's definitely not like, oh, it's so easy, now we've solved it all. But I agree with Idris Elba in a way.
Yeah, I do too. I think you're absolutely right, though. I think maybe you think like, I haven't raped anyone.
Right.
This is not my problem. I think the other issue here too is like, we can talk about the different levels of Me Too, sort of like the assault, the harassment, the catcalling, but when we start to get even further down the ladder, like we're also just talking about the way that women exist in our culture in general. Yeah. The fact that if I go in for a job interview, I probably am gonna get it if we have the same credentials over you two because I'm a white man, you know what I mean? And so there are so many things we have to tease out of this, and I think a lot of people just get exhausted because they're like, how are we ever gonna fix this? This has been going on since the beginning of time. This is the way it's supposed to be, and they just throw their hands up and they think, I can't do it,
It's also, it feels like we use terms like good guys and bad guys that end up forcing you into this binary. I feel like we're all a point on this continuum of good and bad stuff. And like there's dudes who like stand here and they're like, oh, everyone who's behind me is doing bad stuff. Everyone's ahead of me is doing good stuff, but they're okay with where they are. And like we shouldn't be content. We should be like reflecting and building on those sorts of things.
I just witnessed something actually on my way here that speaks to everything we've said, where it's also this idea of like, none of us get off scot-free, even if you are the nice guy. Like, I was crossing St. Mark's on 4th Avenue to get here, and in the middle of the crosswalk, I was walking next to a woman and a guy was walking towards us. And in the middle of the crosswalk, he stops her and he's like, sorry, I know we're in the middle of the crosswalk, but I just want to tell you you're really cute. Mm-hmm. And she kept walking, and you could see that she was bothered by it. And I wanted to say like, what the are you doing? And I didn't. I'm gonna say it's because I was Russian here, but I should have said something. Just like, even if it's in passing, like, what are you doing? Just make it clear that that's not cool. And I think that's, to Taryn's point, like men have to be the ones holding other men accountable, because even if the woman sort of loses no matter what there, right? If she keeps her quiet, you've been harassed. If you speak out, you're being uppity or whatever.
Or you put yourself in a position where you're not safe.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I definitely think we're all on this spectrum of you're not good or bad, and we all have to speak out.
I think of Terry Crews, he's been really outspoken.
Because a lot of people don't believe that a person like me could actually be victimized.
The fact that there were people who were questioning his masculinity, questioning exactly immediately and saying like, oh, you're a 6-something brolic dude, black guy, this doesn't even sound believable. Right. And it's just like we have to acknowledge and like make space for those stories too, and understand, that consent is for everyone, literally everyone. I feel like there are people who haven't even heard of the word consent used in like a relationship basis until the Me Too movement kind of started to pop off online.
Yeah. And there aren't a lot of spaces equipped for men to talk about these things.
Right.
People talk about it over drinks, over weed. Like, they don't go to therapy. And like, speaking of Terry Crews, it allowed me in therapy to be open about like times where I was like, I didn't feel comfortable with this, and I'm not at a place where I'm ready to confront those people, but like that sort of thing was hard because I was like, yo, this is the dude who's the Old Spice dude. This is the dude who's like flexing his pecs and like was just mad brolic on these commercials. And now the moment that he's like, yo, I was touched by this person who had a lot more power than me and wanted to exercise that over me. Now we're all just gonna like turn on him and be like, oh, that's not a dude anymore. It's like, it feels like masculinity can be like challenged by anything as simple as like, oh, you smell a little flowery right now. You're not a man, to like, oh, you let someone actually harm you? Come on, dog. No dude lets another dude harm him. You're like, what?
Masculinity should not be this fragile.
It shouldn't be.
It should not. It's a beautiful thing, and the fact that society has made it as fragile as it is really compromises, not only masculinity, but it compromises how a man can feel feminine and embrace his femininity. Like I consider myself, like a masculine woman. Like that doesn't, make me less of a woman, and that shouldn't make, a man feel like less of a man if he, embraces his femininity.
Yeah, and the parallel shouldn't be like feminine, weak, masculine, strong.
Right.
Like you're gonna fluctuate between those things, and the weakness shouldn't be the thing that's attached to women. It just shouldn't be that way. So.
What would you like to see from masculinity moving forward?
I think just people being open to sort of questioning what is important and why masculinity is sort of privileged. I think we're getting to that place. And I think a lot of it has to do with the examples we're setting, the conversations we're having or not having. But I'm really hopeful. I think that some of this has to do with like older generations and how stuck they are in this mold that's been set for them. And I think because of social media, I think because of feminism, I think because of queer rights, because of the breakdown of the nuclear family, all of these things are happening now that changes the way we think about who we are. And I think that's just gonna keep snowballing.
I wanna see so much. I guess for starters, I wanna see more of the survivors being believed, being listened to. I want to see more people being empowered to tell their stories. And I think, we're definitely on the road to that. I also want to see, more men interrogating themselves and interrogating their circles. I want to see a whole reprogramming of how we view masculinity.
I think I want to see men start to define themselves outside of just the contrast to women and the dominance over women. I think it could be really fun. I think men could have a lot of fun with actually feeling like they can pick and choose what they want to define themselves with. That's not necessarily something that's been prescribed to them before.
I mean, I agree with what you've all said, and I think this sort of review is really necessary for all of us to sort of look back on, okay, who have I been up to this point as a man? What has that meant? And even if you think of yourself as a good guy or a nice guy, how have you maybe been part of the problem? I don't think we can really progress without looking backwards a little bit, especially just on a personal level. So I do think, it's something I've seen with my friends, it's conversations we're having where we're revisiting certain hookups or certain incidents that happened and being like, well, maybe that feels weird now in 2019. Why? And how do we make sure that doesn't happen going forward?
I think I want to see more men being active listeners, because I feel like we hear people's problems, but we're not like actually trying to help people work through them. Therapy. I want men to be like, yo, it's cool to have feelings and to process things. I feel like we're all so conditioned to be like, we're the logical ones, they're the emotional ones. But that's just not true.